I always knew my brother David was trouble, but I never imagined he'd go this far. He made my life a living hell growing up, stealing from me, bullying me, and making sure I was always the lesser son in my parents' eyes. He got away with everything while I had to work twice as hard for even a fraction of their approval. I thought I'd finally escaped him when I left home, built a career, and started a family of my own. For years, I believed I had moved past the childhood torment. I married the love of my life, Karen, and we built a future together. We had a son, Henry, and I devoted myself to giving him the love and care that I never received growing up. I worked long hours, made sacrifices, and ensured that my family never had to struggle. My life wasn't perfect, but it was stable and I was happy, or so I thought. But then, 3 months ago, everything shattered. It started with Karen acting strangely. She became distant, spending more time on her phone, making excuses to stay late at work, and even avoiding intimacy. At first, I thought it was just the usual stress of married life, but then one evening, she sat me down at the dinner table with a look I had never seen before. Cold. Detached. Then she dropped the bombshell. I need to tell you something. Henry might not be yours. My entire world stopped. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. At first, I thought I had misheard her, that maybe she meant something else, something less horrifying. But then she spoke again, her voice eerily calm, like she was discussing the weather. I've been having an affair. For years. And it's with David. I stared at her, unable to process what I had just heard. My brother? The same person who had tormented me my entire life? The person who had stolen my childhood, my peace, and now, my family? The room felt smaller, suffocating. My hands clenched into fists as I tried to control the rage bubbling inside me. I asked her how long it had been going on. She didn't even flinch when she said, "Since before we got married." My stomach turned. I felt sick. She had been betraying me from the very beginning. But the worst part? She admitted she had known for years that Henry might not be mine. She chose to stay with me because I was the more stable choice. I wasn't her first option. I was just the safe bet. I stood up, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door without another word. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I was going to make sure both of them paid for what they did to me. And oh, they had no idea what was coming. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My wife, no, the woman I thought was my wife, had been sleeping with my brother for years. My son, the boy I had raised, might not even be mine. It felt like my entire life had been one long, elaborate joke. I should have seen the signs. The way David always seemed too friendly with Karen, how he made little comments about how we were so different as a couple. I had brushed it off, thinking he was just being his usual antagonistic self. I never imagined he was that kind of monster. The anger burned through me, but beneath it was something deeper, humiliation. Had everyone seen it but me? Did my parents know? Did our friends suspect? I felt like the biggest fool on earth. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. I needed proof. That night I went back home. Karen was still sitting at the dining table, her eyes red from crying. She tried to talk to me, but I held up my hand to silence her. "We're doing a paternity test," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. She swallowed hard but nodded. Maybe she thought this was her chance to prove that Henry was mine, that we could somehow move past this. I had no intention of giving her that chance. The next morning, I took Henry to the clinic. I didn't tell him why, we just spent the day together like a normal father and son. He was laughing, telling me about school, completely unaware that I was about to find out if I had any reason to call him my son at all. 2 days later, the results came in. And just like that, the last thread of hope I had was gone. Henry was not mine. I stood there, staring at the test results, my hands shaking. It was real. Henry, my son, my boy, the child I had tucked into bed, taught how to ride a bike, stayed up with when he had nightmares, wasn't mine. My entire body felt numb. I walked into the house like a ghost, barely feeling the floor beneath me. Karen was waiting, her eyes searching my face. I didn't say anything. I just placed the envelope on the table. She opened it, scanned the words, and then, she had the audacity to start crying again. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Sorry? My voice was eerily calm. You're sorry? She nodded, wiping her face. I never wanted this to happen. Stop. I cut her off. Stop lying to me. You had an affair with my brother. You stayed with me knowing he could be Henry's father. And you let me love that boy as if he were my own, when you knew. Her lips trembled. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You knew exactly what you were doing. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back like her touch burned me. I need you to leave, I said. Her eyes widened. What? Take your things. Go to your real family, David. Karen fell to her knees, sobbing. Please don't do this. He's just a child, our child. He's not my child. I snapped. She flinched, and for a moment, I hated myself for yelling in front of Henry, who was peeking from the hallway, his eyes wide with confusion. I forced myself to take a breath. This wasn't his fault. I will never hurt Henry. But you? I locked eyes with her. I never want to see you again. Karen packed a bag and left that night. Henry stayed. For the next few days, I barely functioned. I went to work like a zombie. I avoided my phone. I couldn't even look at Henry without feeling my stomach twist. Then my dad called. Son, I need to see you. Now. His voice was tight. Urgent. When I arrived at my parents' house, my mother was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her hands shaking. My father stood by the window, looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. And then I saw him. David. He was standing in the corner, looking completely unbothered, arms crossed over his chest. I clenched my jaw. Why am I here? My dad turned around. Because I needed to hear it for myself. Is it true? Did he really? He couldn't even finish the sentence. David scoffed. Oh, come on, Dad. Are we really going to pretend like this is some big crime? My mother gasped. David. What? He said, rolling his eyes. I mean, it's not like I forced Karen. She came to me. She chose me. I stepped forward so fast my dad had to put a hand on my chest to stop me from lunging at him. You stole my life. My voice was low, dangerous. David smirked. Oh, please. You're acting like I held a gun to her head. She wanted me. Guess that just proves who the better man is. Something in my father snapped. Get out, he roared. David's cocky expression faltered. Dad, come on. You are not my son. My father's voice trembled with rage. You are a disgrace. You have humiliated this family, betrayed your brother, and ruined everything. I am done with you. David's smirk disappeared entirely. What the hell does that mean? My father turned to me. Come with me. We went to his office. He pulled open a drawer and handed me a stack of legal documents. I'm changing my will, he said. David gets nothing. My eyes widened. Dad, no, he said firmly. He is no longer my son. I swallowed hard. I had never seen my father so resolute. When we walked back out, David was still standing there, now looking genuinely nervous. Dad, he tried again. You don't mean that. My father didn't even look at him. He just pointed at the door. Leave. David clenched his fists. His face twisted in fury. You think you can just cut me out? Fine. But don't come crying to me when you realize he isn't as perfect as you think he is. With that, he stormed out. My mother sat there in stunned silence. My father, looking exhausted, turned to me. I should have done that years ago. For the first time in a long time, I actually believed him. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Karen tried to call, but I blocked her. David showed up at my house once, but I didn't even let him get past the front door. I focused on Henry. Even though he wasn't mine biologically, I couldn't just turn my back on him. He was confused, hurt, and didn't understand why his mother wasn't around anymore. Is Mommy coming back? He asked one night as I tucked him in. I forced a smile. She loves you, buddy. But she and I aren't going to be together anymore. He frowned. Did I do something wrong? My heart shattered. No, Henry. You did nothing wrong. You are perfect just the way you are. But deep down, I knew this arrangement wouldn't last forever. Karen and David didn't leave me alone for long. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. You need to talk to me. Karen's voice sent a wave of nausea through me. There's nothing to talk about, I said coldly. There is. You can't just pretend like none of this happened. I scoffed. That's exactly what I plan to do. I'm done with you. She was quiet for a second. Then, Henry is asking for you. That hit differently. Put him on the phone, I demanded. No, she said quickly. Not unless we talk first. I clenched my jaw. You don't get to use my son, no, my brother's son, as leverage. He still sees you as his father. That part hurt. You made sure that would never be true, I bit out. Then she dropped the bombshell. David and I are moving in together. I laughed bitterly. Of course you are. He wants to be a good father to Henry. I almost threw my phone across the room. David? A good father? That man doesn't know how to take care of anyone but himself. Please, she begged. Don't take your anger out on Henry. I would never hurt Henry, I said through gritted teeth. But you? I never want to see you again. I hung up. And that was that. But, of course, that wasn't that. A month later, my dad called. We need to talk, he said. I drove over, already feeling on edge. When I walked in, my mom was sitting at the kitchen table, nervously wringing her hands. What's going on? I asked, looking between them. My father sighed. Your mother told David about my will. I froze. What? My mother started crying. I felt bad for him. He's still my son. I felt rage bubbling up inside me. He slept with my wife, Mom? I shouted. He ruined my marriage, took everything from me, and you still think he deserves anything? She flinched. I just thought, maybe if he apologized, if we could fix things. My father shook his head in disgust. We were done with him, he said. And now he knows what I was planning. And guess what? He called a lawyer. My stomach dropped. What? He's trying to contest my will. I let out a humorless laugh. Of course he is. David was many things, manipulative, selfish, cruel, but stupid? No. He knew exactly how to play people, especially our mother. I turned to her. This is what you did, I said coldly. She started sobbing harder. I'm sorry. I didn't think he would. I just wanted to help. My father slammed his hand on the table. Enough. The room went silent. If he wants a war, my dad said, voice like steel, he's got one. If David wanted a war, my dad was ready to give him one. I had never seen my father so angry before. The betrayal ran deep, not just because David had slept with my wife, but because now he was actively trying to steal from the very family he had already destroyed. He doesn't deserve a dime, my dad spat. I agreed. So what do we do? I asked. My father took a slow breath, his expression hard. We make sure he loses everything. That's when I learned that my dad had already started preparing for this. Even before David called his lawyer, my father had met with his own. He wanted everything airtight, every loophole closed. He had already legally transferred most of his assets into a trust with me as the sole beneficiary. Even if he contests the will, my father explained, he won't win. There's nothing left in my name to inherit. David had no idea. He thought he could fight in court, drag things out, maybe manipulate my mom into helping him one last time. But he was walking into a trap. I wanted to see his face when he realized it. I was there along with my dad, our lawyer, and David's attorney. My mother had refused to come, too ashamed to face my father after what she had done. David, however, sauntered in like he owned the place. Well, he said with a smirk. Guess you finally decided to talk, old man? My dad didn't even look at him. Sit down, David. David flopped into his chair like this was all some big joke. Listen, he started, leaning forward. This doesn't have to get messy. I'm willing to negotiate. I almost laughed. Negotiate? I repeated. You mean steal? His eyes flicked to me, the smirk slipping just a little. I'm not stealing anything. I'm just claiming what's mine. I folded my arms. Nothing is yours. David's lawyer cleared his throat. My client is contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence. Given the strained relationship between Mr. Benson and his younger son, there is reason to believe he was pressured into cutting him out. Save it, our lawyer interrupted smoothly. He slid a thick folder across the table. Everything has already been settled. David frowned. His lawyer opened the folder and started reading. As his expression darkened, David leaned over, trying to see what was written. "What is this?" David demanded. "Proof," my father said, finally looking at him, "that you don't get a single cent." David's mouth opened. Close. His lawyer turned to him. "They already moved everything into a trust. There's nothing left to contest." David shot up from his chair. "This is bullshit," he snapped. "You can't just cut me out." My father's expression didn't change. "I just did." David's face turned red. His hands clenched into fists. "This isn't fair." I tilted my head. "You slept with my wife, got her pregnant, and now you want our father's money? How do you even say that with a straight face?" He glared at me. "I deserve something." "No, David," my dad said quietly. "You don't deserve anything." David stormed out. I watched him go, waiting for the explosion. And I was right. Because the next thing I knew, my phone was ringing. It was Karen. David thought he had won. He really believed he could manipulate his way back into my father's will, drag our family through the mud, and somehow still come out on top. But he underestimated just how much my father despised traitors. 2 weeks after his dramatic phone call to me, we received the official lawsuit notice. David was contesting the will, claiming undue influence and financial coercion had left him unfairly disinherited. I almost laughed when I read it. The audacity of this man. After everything he'd done, after betraying me in the worst possible way, he thought he still deserved a payout? He wanted to fight dirty? Fine. He had no idea what was coming. Our lawyer shredded his case apart before it even reached the courtroom. First, my father had moved his assets into a trust before the will was read, meaning there was nothing for David to inherit anyway. Even if by some miracle he won, he would walk away with nothing. Second, his entire claim rested on the idea that he had been mistreated by our family, but his financial records painted a different picture. He had been given everything: free rent, tuition, a car, cash whenever he asked. He had never worked a day in his life. My father had funded every aspect of his existence, and when he was cut off, he ran straight to the courts hoping to force our hand. The judge wasn't going to buy it. But the real nail in his coffin was the affair. We had receipts, text messages, emails, even security footage from a hotel. Karen's confession was on record. The moment our lawyer presented the evidence, the color drained from David's face. His lawyer glanced at him, clearly realizing they were doomed. When the judge reviewed everything, they barely even entertained his case before shutting it down. "There is no legal basis for this claim," the judge stated. "The evidence presented overwhelmingly contradicts the allegations." Case dismissed. Just like that, it was over. David stood there frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't process what had just happened. When he finally moved, he turned toward me, his face twisting in rage. "You think this is funny?" he hissed. I smirked. "A little." His fists clenched at his sides, his whole body trembling. "You ruined my life," he yelled, his voice echoing down the courthouse hallway. "You turned our parents against me, you took everything." "I didn't take anything," I cut in coldly. "You lost everything the second you betrayed me." He took a shaky breath, his eyes wild with desperation. "You don't understand. I had no choice. Karen, I raised an eyebrow. "She what? Tricked you into sleeping with her? Forced you to lie for years? Manipulated you into stealing from our parents? Grow the hell up, David. You did this to yourself." He looked at me like he wanted to hit me, but he knew better. He shook his head furiously. "You don't get it. This isn't over." I chuckled, stepping closer. "No, David. It is over. And you lost." He stormed out of the courthouse, shoving past people like a child throwing a tantrum. That was the last time I saw him in person. But his downfall was just beginning. The lawsuit had been his last-ditch effort to secure money, and it failed spectacularly. He had nothing left. He was drowning in debt, barely scraping by, and to make things worse, Karen had started demanding child support. Turns out she wasn't as loyal to David as he thought. She wanted money, and now that my father had cut him off, she wasn't getting any. When David couldn't pay, she sued him. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had destroyed my marriage for a woman who was now dragging him through the legal system for every cent he didn't have. Desperate, David started reaching out to everyone. Old friends, distant relatives, anyone who might take pity on him. Nobody did. His reputation was ruined. The same family members who once coddled him were now disgusted by his actions. Even our mother had finally run out of excuses for him. But the final blow came when he tried to crawl back to my father. One night, my dad called me, sounding almost amused. Guess who showed up at my house today? I didn't have to guess. He was crying, my dad continued, begging me to reconsider. Said he made a mistake, that he was sorry. I waited for the part where my father gave in, but it never came. I told him to leave, he said simply. Told him that from the moment he decided to betray his own family, he stopped being my son. I exhaled, feeling a strange sense of relief. My father had always been stubborn, but I had never been sure whether he would truly follow through with cutting David off. Now I knew. David called me that night. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened to it, his voice was broken, barely above a whisper. You win, he said. I have nothing. Are you happy now? I deleted the message. 'Cause yes, I was. David had spent his entire life being handed things. He had never worked for anything, never taken responsibility, never faced real consequences. But now, he had nothing. No money. No family. No safety net. And for the first time in his pathetic existence, he had to deal with the consequences of his own actions. And that was the best revenge of all. David's downfall wasn't just about losing money or getting cut off. No, that was just the beginning. What followed was pure, poetic justice, and he never saw it coming. At first, I assumed he would disappear quietly, maybe find some minimum wage job, live in some rundown apartment, and slowly fade into irrelevance. But David wasn't the kind of guy to accept his fate with dignity. He was desperate. And when desperate people have nothing left to lose, they self-destruct. A few months after the lawsuit, I got a call from a private investigator. My father had hired him to keep tabs on David, just in case he tried anything reckless. And sure enough, David was scheming again. Apparently, after Karen took him to court for child support, David started looking for ways to make fast cash. He had maxed out credit cards, burned through whatever money he had left, and was now in serious debt. He owed thousands in gambling losses and had borrowed money from some very dangerous people. He was spiraling fast. But the real kicker? He had been forging documents again. The investigator found out that David had been using fake pay stubs and bank statements to try and get loans. He was applying for new credit cards under fake identities, using stolen social security numbers, and even attempting to fraudulently claim government assistance. This wasn't just some petty scam, this was full-blown financial fraud. I had a choice. I could ignore it, let him dig his own grave, or I could bury him myself. I called my lawyer. Let's end this. Within a week, every fraudulent loan application, every fake document, and every shady financial move David had made was reported to the authorities. My father, already furious with him, pressed charges for the inheritance lawsuit and the money David had stolen from my parents' accounts. The banks he had scammed launched their own investigations. And then came the arrest. I wasn't there when the police took him, but I heard about it from my cousin. David had been at some dingy bar, drowning his sorrows, when 3 officers walked in. They pulled him out in handcuffs while he screamed, "This isn't fair. My family did this to me." "No, David. You did this to yourself." The trial was brutal. The evidence was overwhelming. Fraud. Identity theft. Forgery. Multiple counts of financial crimes. The judge had no sympathy. The moment they read his 5-year prison sentence, David's face went ghost white. He actually looked at me like I could save him. I just stared back, stone-faced, as the bailiffs led him away. The best part? Since he was now a convicted felon, Karen was legally entitled to demand full custody and even garnish his wages once he got out. The woman he had betrayed me for was now the one ruining whatever future he had left. But I wasn't done yet. See, David had spent his whole life being handed everything. Now he was about to experience what it was like to have nothing. My father legally blocked him from the family estate, meaning that even after he got out of prison he would never see a single cent. No inheritance. No second chances. Nothing. His name was erased from every financial document. Meanwhile I thrived. My career skyrocketed. I built a new life, free of the toxic weight of David's existence. My father and I became closer than ever. Even my mother, once David's greatest defender, never spoke his name again. David? He rotted in prison. The last I heard, he was miserable, struggling to survive behind bars, where nobody cared about his sob stories. Years later, when he finally got out, he tried one last time to reach out to me. He showed up at my office looking like a ghost of himself. He had lost weight, his eyes were sunken, and the cocky arrogance he once carried was gone. "I just need a little help," he mumbled, voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, silent. "Please?" he added, tears forming in his eyes. I exhaled slowly. Then I spoke the last words I would ever say to him. "You stopped being my brother the day you betrayed me. And you stopped being my problem the day they locked you up." I walked past him without another word. And just like that, David was nothing to me. He had spent his whole life thinking he was untouchable. Thinking he could do whatever he wanted, hurt whoever he wanted, and still win. But in the end, I won. Because I walked away with everything. And David? He walked away with nothing.